We have mics 1 and 3, okay? Thank you. Delaney, excuse me, Delaney. I'm showing 7 p.m., which is our start time. Do you want to? Good evening and welcome to St. Patrick Parish. I'm Tim Grove, I'm Director of Faith Formation, and tonight is event 2 of our 5-part series on 5 consecutive Thursday evenings entitled Walking in My Shoes, a challenge to eradicate racism. Tonight's program is a panel of storytellers. We have 4 with us tonight. Our top 4 choices that we brainstormed all said yes. So I hope that bodes well for our evening. But our sort of process this evening, I will introduce the 4 panelists. I'll explain kind of how we're going to proceed. And then Deacon Scott will offer a prayer. And then we will start the storytelling. We'll follow storytelling with questions and comments from among the panelists because they haven't heard each other's stories yet. So we will allow them to do that. And then we will, if you have questions following that, raise your hand. We will get to you with a microphone so it's heard on the live stream, okay? So we have people watching from several states, and I want to say hello to Sister Alicia with the Loretto sisters, who is hopefully tuning in by now. So she is going to join us on the live stream. So we welcome you, and it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome our panel. First up, Loueva Moss. Where are you, Loueva? There she is. She's waving. Loueva was born and raised in Lebanon, Kentucky, and attended St. Monica School in Bardstown. Correct? No, it was in Lebanon at the time. Okay, there was one there. Okay, thank you. She learned at an early age that her life would be grounded in the service of others. Eventually, she earned an undergraduate degree in nursing from Spalding University, and that led her to serve 33 years as a school nurse in Jefferson County Public Schools in the Exceptional Student Education Department. For her many hours of service to her home parish, Christ the King Catholic Church, and her West Louisville community, Loueva was a recipient of WLKY-TV's Bell Award in 2009. Years later, the Office of Multicultural Ministries gave her its Acacia Award for her service to the church. And this year, in 2021, Loueva is a Salute to Catholic Schools honoree. So we welcome Loueva. Kim Mapp is another one of our panelists. There's Kim. She has a really cool mask. Kim is from Guyana, South America. Kim and her family came to the United States in 1966 and settled in our nation's capital initially. She attended Catholic school all the way through high school, then went on to American University where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology on a full academic Frederick Douglass Scholarship. She spent her career working for the American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, and American Lung Association, and the Health Department in various locations. She moved to Louisville in 2003 and worked in similar roles here. And also, Kim has served as the director of the Catholic Enrichment Center, which is in West Louisville. We thank you for that. And she currently is the clinical coordinator and assistance center director for the Area Health Education Center. Is that correct? That's a lot of words there, Kim. Kim serves as the chairperson of the St. Martin de Porres Parish Leadership Team, also in West Louisville, and also St. Martin's Social Concern and Social Justice Ministry. How about that, Deacon Scott? Included, there's, in her life, she says, there's, quote, a whole lot of volunteering and serving on various boards. So you have a servant's heart, obviously. Kim, we welcome you to St. Patrick. Our third panelist may have the highest public profile of our four, and for quite heroic reasons. Christopher Truex has been an advocate for peace and justice in the Louisville community for the past 20 years. He's sitting right there. You might want to wave. There he is. Okay, he's got the knit hat on because that's hip, right? He is often contacted to help mediate or resolve high-profile incidents involving race and violence in the community. We've all seen you on TV being interviewed. You always seem to me to be a comforting presence for the family that has just suffered, has been victimized in some way. So on behalf of pastoral care ministers everywhere, I thank you for that. He is passionate about promoting early childhood education as a way to ending gun violence long term. In 2018, Christopher established Game Changers. He may talk about that. It's a nonprofit which leads a movement for social justice through education and nonviolence, so all children can reach their full potential. Among his awards and recognitions, Christopher was presented the Dr. Joan E. Thomas Lifetime Achievement Award for Peacemaking by the Center for Women and Families, and that was in 2018. And he also received an honorary doctorate of public service from Spalding University, and in 2020 named Man of the Year from Community Connections Group. So, Christopher, we warmly welcome you to St. Patrick as a panelist. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Bennie Ivory. Bennie and our own parishioner, John Mura, have an association going back decades, not only through their work at the Courier-Journal, but in probably two different papers prior to that, one in Delaware. John says Bennie hired John twice, so that's a credit to John, and maybe it says something about their friendship and good working relationship. But I invite John Mura forward to introduce Bennie Ivory.
Well, we're in for a treat tonight. I've known Bennie since 1999 when he hired me from Connecticut to work with him in Delaware. Bennie is a product of the South. He was born and raised in Little Rock. Hot Springs. And he decided, luckily for everyone, to go into journalism. His accomplishments are many. He helped to launch USA Today. He ran newsrooms in Mississippi, in Florida, in Delaware, and for 16 years here at the CJ. I was fortunate to work with him in 2 of those newsrooms and saw him transform both of those places. And he did that because he had a singular vision that, I mean, you hear the story that journalists are supposed to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Well, Bennie took that seriously. He was a bear about driving his staff to look at people in the margins and to tell their stories in meaningful ways. I'm proud to say I did the best journalism of my life working with that man. He's a great editor, a great mentor, and a great friend. And as editor of a newspaper, and especially here, you get to know the community in a very deep way. You get to understand how it works and how it doesn't work. So whatever, I don't know what Bennie's going to talk about, but whatever it is, trust me, it's from the heart and he knows what he's talking about. So it's my great pleasure to welcome him, and I'm sure you're in for a treat.
Thank you, John, and welcome to you, Bennie, and welcome, give a warm St. Patrick welcome to all 4 of our panelists, if you would. Join me. So thank you. We will give the panelists each 15 minutes to share their stories. I will be the timekeeper. I've told them that I will signal them at about 3 minutes so they can sum up or add necessary details and wrap up their storytelling period. We're just doing that in the interest of time to stay on schedule for the purpose of our live stream and what we announced. Let's see. So then we will move forward with the next panelist right away. There won't be any Q&A in between. That will happen at the end. Okay. And so we'll have them comment on one another's stories first, ask questions, and then after that we will open it up to the assembly gathered. And if you have a question, raise your hand, a comment, raise your hand, and we will want to get to you with a microphone so you're heard by the assembly present and by our live streaming audience. Okay, great. So our plan is to conclude at 9 p.m. If we need to go overtime because we're in the midst of real intense conversation or something that needs more resolve, we'll negotiate that at the 9 o'clock hour. We are a community of faith here at St. Patrick, so before we begin a work of service or faith enrichment, we call to mind the presence of God, always with us and around us in mysterious ways. To lead us in prayer, I invite forward our own Deacon Scott Hayner. Sorry.
The quality of our panel demands this be a short prayer because I want to hear what you guys got to say. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we praise you and thank you for all the blessings in our lives. You bless us so abundantly. And we thank you for bringing these people together today to share their stories because you call us to respect the dignity and worth of all people. There have been times in the past and even in the present that we don't live up to that ideal. Sometimes we only get so focused on our own world that we don't realize that other people are living different realities. And so we appreciate the opportunity to hear the life experiences of these people, and we welcome them to our community. We ask that you be with us, not only tonight as we hear the stories, but also as we discern what you're asking us to learn, and that we open our hearts to what might be a better way to move forward in the future. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
So we will begin the storytelling with Mrs. Loueva Moss. So Loueva, come on forward here. And we've let every storyteller know they can remove the mask they're wearing for the time of storytelling, so she will do that.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening. It is my joy and my pleasure to share my stories with you this evening. As stated in the introduction, that I am originally from the Catholic Holy Land, Lebanon, Kentucky, Marion County, where I still do believe that probably 80% of that population is Catholic, very staunch Catholics. On Saturday afternoons at 4 o'clock, you'd think they were giving away something. People still go to confession at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoons. The street and the parking lot is crowded. But I was raised back in the day, prior to desegregation. The atmosphere that I grew up in, on one side of the street was a small red brick building that had a school. The church was on top, and the bottom was a school for grades 1 through 8. That was the school for the colored children. Directly across the street from there was this huge, and I'm sure some of you have been to Lebanon, you have seen St. Augustine property there. Huge, beautiful, very ornate church, very large population. Then, though, we could not go to worship or anything within that church proper. The one thing, though, we always had beautiful angelic choirs. So on Sunday morning, the white parishioners from St. Augustine would come out and stand in the street because, we didn't have air conditioning, particularly in the summers, so we had to open the windows in the choir loft. They would stand outside in the street to listen to us sing. And again, going back now, I look back, my family were very, very staunch Catholics. Basically, you prayed and you obeyed. You didn't ask questions. And we were educated by the Sisters of Loretto, very, very compassionate, very, very parents particularly, well-liked, understood, and they understood and worked very well with the families there. Back then, I don't recall as being, because I was only able to go from 1st grade through 8th grade at St. Monica's, but I do remember having to, particularly if they had missions, or if there was something special where the Archbishop at that time was coming to Lebanon for something. Of course, we had to sit in the back of the church, and at communion, we had to wait in the rear of the church until everybody else had received communion before we could receive communion. So pardon me if I get a little emotional, because sharing my story has been healing for me, because I know I don't have enough time to go into all of it, but it has been difficult for me to stay in this church. But my Catholic faith and my upbringing has taught me that I'm not going anywhere. I have stayed the course, I have weathered the storms, and I'm still about making some change. But one of my stories is back then, because we could not go to St. Augustine's High School. Remember, this is prior to desegregation. So the Archdiocese for women, young girls, the Archdiocese of Louisville would pay the tuition for young girls to go to Holy Family all-girls boarding school in New Orleans, Louisiana. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that. It's run by the Sisters of the Holy Family. The building is still there. The school is no longer in existence. What I'm getting to is my sister, who is 4 years older than I, had the opportunity to attend 4 years of boarding school that the Archdiocese paid for. When it came time for me to go to high school, the Archdiocese said they didn't have any more money, so the program was disbanded. So I ended up having to go to the public Rosenwald High School there in Lebanon, which was the high school for so-called colored students, okay? And again, I look back on it, you know, we didn't know what racism really was all about. I knew that the stores there that had the fountains, remember the old, I call them like the drug stores, they always had a counter with the fountains with the great ice cream and milkshakes and whatever. We knew we could not sit on those stools, and we could not, you know, sit there and eat our sundae or have our milkshake. We had to stand as you came in the door, and the proprietor would summon one of you come forward and place your order. You take your order and you go out the door. But again, you know, back then, it's the way it was. And our parents, again, you prayed and you obeyed. When the change really entered my life is when I completed high school and I came to Louisville to attend nursing school. At that time, your first year was at what was then Nazareth College. I was the only black African-American student from Kentucky at that time entered. We had 3 other African-American students from Holy Family School in Birmingham, Alabama. But when I came to Louisville, I remember my father and grandfather having to bring me down. So they didn't tell me, but my dad said, they said, you have to go meet with these people at Nazareth College before I take you out to the dorm. Because really the nursing program was at the old St. Mary and Elizabeth Hospital, which was at 12th and Magnolia at that time. So make a long story short, they said, even though I was valedictorian of my high school class, they said I had to take 2 additional tests in order to be accepted into that program at Nazareth College. And that's when it kind of began to click in my mind. Why me? Why me? All the other white girls there were signing up for their classes and going to the bookstore and doing everything. And I've got to sit in this auditorium all by myself with this pencil and paper and all of these, I won't tell you the name today I called it, but all of that I had to write about and answer questions for to prove my, not educational, but really just to point something to get in the way to prove that you're not good enough, that you have to meet that second criteria. But going on down the line, got through that, went through St. Mary's nursing school. My class was the first class to graduate from the new hospital, which is out on Bluegrass Avenue now in South Louisville, I guess they call it. Okay, so I got married after nursing school, started having children, again, practicing my faith, very loyal. At that time in West Louisville, west of 28th Street, there were no black families. And if you know anything about the city of Louisville then and now, if you notice after 28th Street, the streets changed names. And the whole reason for that is because it was part of their racial divide. If you understand Chestnut Street, once you pass 28th Street, it becomes River Park Drive, all white community. Magazine Street became Vermont Avenue. Okay. Walnut Street, which was predominantly a lot of black nightclubs and a lot of black entertainment, and a lot of black people lived on Walnut Street. But then when you passed 28th Street, see, it became Michigan Drive. Now, over the years, some of those names have changed, because my family, with my husband and our children, we were the first black family to move on Michigan Drive in the 4300 block. And that was like in right, it'll be in 1967. Okay, so that's when my real journey into understanding about the Catholic Church and its ideals and racism. I chose, because I'm living like 4 blocks from Christ the King Church, which basically then was an all-white parish. So, you know, hey, I bounced right on over there with my baby, you know, and I introduced myself after Mass. And again, you know, I was there, you know, out of habit. I didn't sit in front. I kind of sit towards the back. After Mass, I introduced myself to the pastor. And was my mother being staunch today was, if you didn't have a baby baptized by 6 weeks of age, you got hell to pay. You better get busy and do something. So I wanted my baby baptized, you know. And he told me he could not baptize my baby. And I asked him, why? My mother says, oh, no, I just needed to come see you and join the parish. And he says, no, I'm not baptizing that black baby. Well, needless to say, of course, through the tears and the crying, I went home and kind of dealt with it. But then the next week, one of the parishioners from the church visited our home, and they told us that, at that time, I didn't even know that churches had boundaries. So by me living in the 4300 block of Michigan Drive, I had to go to St. Columba, which was at around 38th and Market Streets, much farther distance from me. But I made up my mind. You can't tell me where I have to go to church. So I joined the church and continued to go to Christ the King. But in the meantime, another good friend of mine, God rest his soul, was the chaplain at St. Mary, St. Elizabeth's Hospital at the time, and his name was Father Lammers, Father Gerald Lammers. And I ran into him because I was still working at St. Mary's at the time. And Father Lammers was pastor of St. Charles Church at 27th and Chestnut. He said, Loueva and Arthur, my husband, bring the baby to Mass Sunday morning. I will baptize your baby with favor. So that's how my first child was baptized. And to me, that was a classic example of systemic racism. I've learned a lot how systemic racism becomes and how it impacts certain individuals and how basically it is embedded in the people. Our church, for one, you know, if you have listened to a lot of the Zoom sessions or talks that have been out, I've read a lot of the material. Our church is one that they do a lot of talking, they develop a lot of mandates, but nothing is done. Nothing is put into place. It's just talk and printed on paper, okay? So, but like I said, weathering those storms, my faith, my daily prayers, and asking for forgiveness along the way has been kind of healing for me. Even on my 33 years with the Jefferson County Public School System and the Metro Health Department, very subtle racism, you know, because some people will take what they call kindness in a way to let you know you're still at this level and you're not equal to me. It didn't take me long to sense those actions among some of my other employees. And then when I went back to Spalding, which became Spalding University, and got my degree, that's when I almost had to take them to court. Because again, they would hire new RNs out of school and pay them more than me, who had a degree and many more years of service. Purely racist, purely racist. There was no other reason for it. But then again, after we went through the EEOC and some of the civil rights things, and they realized they were either going to pay me enough that I could have retired at 30 years of age, or they were going to change their policies. So their policies are in place now, and hopefully people are staying on top of it. But it's that sometimes it's that very few people that I am, that I have opportunity to be confronted or even to talk and work with today, even in my community, are brazen enough to be outward. But you can go in a store. If I go into Walmart sometimes, you know, it's the way the employees address you, or they will ask, one even asked me, it's been before COVID, because I haven't been in those stores since COVID, but prior to COVID, I was in a Walmart, and I was shopping, and I asked for looking for an appliance, and I asked for this small appliance, and I was asking some questions, and the lady said, "Do you think you can afford that?" So anyway, I moved on because I didn't want to be in jail that night. So, you know, but I'm saying, you know, it's just that, and that's what we continue to be confronted with even today. So in the long run, if you walking in my shoes, this program and these sessions that you are attending, as you listen, you learn, you reflect, and hopefully you're called to act. Now that doesn't mean you have to go out here and be with every protest or whatever's going on, but act by transforming within. Okay, that, you know, that action makes a big difference. And particularly those of you who have young children, because some of you, probably as old as I am, you know, it may be a little hard for you to make your changes now, but if we don't change our children mindset and help, because see, children are not born racist. This is environmental, and it is taught in the home. So that's where it has to happen. We need to start with these babies, with our children, and help them to see, you know, what's important and how all lives matter. It doesn't matter about your color. It doesn't matter about your faith. It doesn't matter about what church you go to or how well you dress or not dress or whatever. It's about the individual person. So all I want to do, you to take tonight, is to take some opportunity as you go forward to talk to your family or talk to your friends or talk to somebody. You're not in this alone. And you're not the only one feeling, maybe having some of these attitudes that you may have or may not have. But you need to talk about it. You need to open it up. And then you need to decide, with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, to change your heart and your thinking and the way we treat each other. Thank you.
That didn't deserve a time limit, I'll tell you. Thank you very much, Loueva. I don't know where my phone is, so I can't time anything. But I was speaking on Deacon Scott's watch, so Yes, thank you so much, Loueva. We've asked for the candid stories of these panelists, unvarnished, and so that's what we're hoping to get. So we asked for it. Next up, delighted to welcome Kim Mapp. Kim. I'm going to attach this to you because that way you won't have to run with it. There you go. Should pick up really well. And if you want to move, you just carry that.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Telesford Mapp, and as Tim said, you know, my family moved here to the United States in 1966. I'm cradle Catholic, you know, raised in the church. You know, when my parents came to the United States, well, first my dad came. He came on vacation and then realized that in the United States that education is free. That's one thing I try to get through to students I'm working with. I work with young people now, and I try to let them know how important an education is and that not everyone has opportunities to get an education. So in my country, you know, elementary school, you can go to elementary school, you know, free, but beyond that, you have to pay. And so when my dad came here and realized that you can go to school free, you know, he came here on vacation, stayed, and then sent for us. And we still ended up in Catholic school because at the time the public schools in D.C. were in such bad shape that we ended up in Catholic school. So, you know, we were raised, the country we came from, we didn't know racism. When we came here, we didn't even realize what racism was. And I really probably didn't understand until I went off to college what true racism is all about. You know, we came in '66, that's when, you know, they had the riots in Washington, D.C. King had just been killed. And, but we felt, we were kind of isolated because when we first moved to Washington, D.C., we lived in an area known as Southeast D.C., Anacostia. When we moved to Southeast D.C., it was predominantly white. My first grade classroom, there were only 2 black children, me and Vanita Hawkins, in my first grade class. Vanita and I are still friends to this day. And because I had an accent, they used to tease me and tell me I was speaking Spanish. That's why I have no accent now, because I practiced losing the accent so I wouldn't be teased. You know, we didn't know about bullying back in those days. But, you know, we moved there in '66. In the early 70s, probably around 70, 71, my parents bought our first home there in Anacostia. In the early 70s, that's when the neighborhood was starting to go through the transition of white flight, which we didn't know anything about that either in those days. I was a child. And so we'd only been living in the house a few years when my parents went on a boat ride with the family down the Potomac River, and we were at home. Well, we were supposed to be in the house, but we were like, you know, it's a nice neighborhood, why? You know, so we were out front on the porch. We didn't leave the yard, but we were on the porch. And a station wagon full of white kids drove by, and they shot my brother in the chest with a BB gun. And my parents, you know, we didn't have cell phones back then, so my parents just happened to have just come home. They called the police. My uncle, worried about my brother, double parked out front. And when the police came, you know, they asked my uncle to move his car, and he said, you know, just give me a minute, I just need to check on my nephew. And they said, move the car now. Before you knew it, the entire street, and this is a long street, it's a hill, was full of police cars, paddy wagons, the side street full of police cars. My uncle was beaten to a pulp, to a point. He was an artist. He worked for Hechinger, which is the today version of Lowe's and Home Depot. He hand drew all of the sales circulars. They didn't have computers back then, but they handcuffed him to the point where it cut all of his ligaments. He was never able to draw the same way again after that. But they ended up beating him to a pulp. They hog-tied him. And my uncle he's a little tiny little thing. They hog-tied him, legs, hands together, and dragged him down the street. My father's crying, why are you doing this to, why are you doing this to my brother? They beat my father. They hit him upside his head to the point where he just passed away a couple of years ago. He lost a lot of the vision in his eye. We saw my dad balled up on the ground in the neighbor's yard 2 doors over. He was balled up with just blood. And my brother, who at the time was about 16, maybe 15, the one that got shot, he's standing there crying. They arrested him because he was crying. The police, it took about a week later before they even came and took the story about why we called the report, why we called the police in the first place. Now, I had pretty much forgotten. You kind of put things in the back of your head. My mother, she is a staunch Catholic, staunch. And, our faith requires that we forgive. And so, my mom was one, when something was done, it was done. You don't talk about it anymore. So we really didn't talk about it. But the day when George Floyd was killed, my brother, who was the one that was the victim of the whole thing, he was so devastated. I've never heard my brother talk about that, what happened to him. He had never shared about the way they were treated at the police station, because they told this 15-year-old kid that he was lucky to be alive, that they should have killed him. And like I said, my brother never shared that story. He never told us about his experience until George Floyd, because it brought it all to the surface, all came up to the surface for him of what had happened to our family that night. And, we talk about it now, and we talked to him, and he said, I really should have gotten counseling, but, black folks don't do counseling. We don't do psychiatrists and things like that. You pray and you deal with it. That's how you deal with things. But my brother has held on to this hurt and this pain for all of these years, and it brought it, right to the surface for us. And the thing about it is, we hired an attorney, a high-profile attorney, was hired by the owner and president of Hechinger Company, because both my dad and my uncle worked for Hechinger, and they were managers. They had worked their way up to be managers at Hechinger's. And so Mr. Hechinger, John Hechinger, hired a high-profile attorney. However, we had to end up dropping the lawsuit because they had trumped up charges saying that, my uncle had broken the police ribs and we had done this and that. And so they said, well, if you drop the lawsuit, we'll drop ours. See, back then you didn't have the cameras to be able to record everything, because, things could have been a lot different for us had there been a recording. Maybe we would not have had that level of brutality had we had the recording. But of course, back then, the police force was still predominantly white. There was one black officer there that night, one. And when somebody asked him, why isn't he intervening, he said he couldn't. He couldn't. All he can do was stand by and watch. So, and I always tell folks, I have a high respect for police. And I have people in my family that are police. I have friends that are police. My sister seemed to have an attraction to policemen. Her current fiance is a retired homicide detective. The previous boyfriend of 17 years was a homicide detective. And boyfriend before that was a police officer. So, it's not that we have anything against police officers. There's just, you run into the one or two bad apples. But that whole incident just brought so much. And then as, these other things kept happening, it's like, I just said, enough is enough. When is this going to stop? We go through, you put these things just deep down because of your faith. And you have to have faith in mankind. You push down these things that you deal with day in and day out. When I was in college, I had I was going pre-med originally, and the head of the pre-med department, not the head of the pre-med department, the advisor for pre-med students. I found out later, because he called me in, and he said, you should really consider going into nursing. I found out later that he called all the women of color into his office and made the same suggestion to them that they consider going into nursing. And I was like, oh my God, did he really do that? And in chemistry class, I had a professor that was just so obviously racist. He would come around, when we were working on our experience, he would never come around to any of the black people. And at that time, American University was 17% minorities, not 7, sorry. It was 7% minorities, not 7% black, 7% minorities. And he would come around, and he wouldn't come anywhere near the few black folks or people of color, because one of my best friends there at school was East Indian. He didn't stop and talk to her or help her out or anything either. I had an issue as a student there with a roommate that was a chain smoker, and I'm asthmatic. I spent almost the entire year just trying to get that roommate removed from the room. I ended up in the hospital for a whole week because they would not move that young lady out of the room with the asthma. I went to that professor to ask if I can get an incomplete or drop the class. He wouldn't let me drop the class. He said, I forgot what it was he said he can give me. It wasn't an incomplete, but what he ended up giving me was a no. He put it in as a no grade. He did not tell me that that would compute as an F. It computed as a 0, and he did not give me the opportunity to take that class again. Of course, when I took the class again under a different professor, I got a B+ out of the class. But this guy's ruined my GPA by giving me a 0. He just put it in as 0. But he could have explained that to me and taken the time, but he didn't. I have children. I worry particularly about my son every day. He lives down the street from me. He's married. He's working. And I still worry about my son if he's going out in the evening. He's gotten stopped here in Louisville a minimum of 4 times. I had a house that I live in Old Louisville. I had a second home I had purchased in West Louisville on Chestnut Street, another Victorian house. And my son and his wife, when they first came back from Kansas City, was living in that house. I gave him my old Mercedes. Young black man driving a Mercedes in West Louisville is like a red flag for the police to pull over. And so one time he got pulled over, and because his driver's license had a South 2nd Street address and he was in West Louisville, they were like, well, where are you going? Well, where do you live? Well, what are you doing here? And he said, well, at this point, I think it was just like a couple blocks from the house. Well, I live there, but why would. So anyway, they literally followed him all the way to the house until he got out of the car, and I guess they saw him open the front door before they actually pulled off. But it's a scary thing. It is a scary, scary thing. He did get arrested once, and the only reason that they got arrested was, like I said, my son went to manual, so the majority of his friends were white. They were in a car, and two of the young men, young boys, they weren't 21 yet. They were drinking beer in the car because they couldn't drink it was at the Mag bar. And they couldn't drink. My son was of age, but the couple of his friends weren't. And so one of the guys, and it was the white kid, was throwing the beer cans out of the car, and the police pulled up and arrested all of them. And one of the police ended up telling one of the white guys that they wouldn't have arrested them if they weren't with the other. Because it was one, my son, African American, and the other was a biracial young man. And if they weren't with them, they wouldn't have arrested them. So that's how my son even got out of that whole thing, is because we were able to say, this is what this officer said, and he couldn't deny it. So, it's just hard. When I go to the store, I always get my receipt back. When you pay for something, they ask you if you want a receipt. I always get my receipt. You know why? I don't want to be accused of stealing anything. So no matter what, I have my receipt. Because like Ms. Moss said, you walk into a store, you get followed. Someone say, well, can I help you? If you're in a store where you don't really belong, it's like you could tell the eyes are on you. But, it's not easy. It's not easy. But, I kind of let these things just go over you. Or, when somebody says, you people, that's the worst thing to say. Or, don't ever say you people. Well, why do you people do this? That can be, that we know what you mean, when you say that. So there's just so many stories to share. My father-in-law, I don't know if I shared this with you, my father-in-law was a civil rights worker person in Chattanooga. He was the first to integrate the school systems in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He had the longest running lawsuit against the city. And it was 27 years, because he wasn't trying to just integrate the schools. He wanted the schools to be equal for all children. And that included poor white children, because there was a difference on education there. But in his civil rights work, he helped to integrate the fire department, the police department. He was head of NAACP. But my father-in-law had a hard life. He had his house, the house was bombed one Sunday while they were at church. They've had the cross burned on the lawn. They've had the sugar in the tank. My husband never realized or understood why his father, before they even were allowed to get into the car, would check under the hood. He got death threats daily. So he was not, my husband said we weren't allowed to answer the phone in the house because his father didn't want them exposed that way to what he was experiencing, in his work, trying to make everything equal for everybody. So, they now have a federal office building named for him, which was unusual because they did it before he passed away. They normally don't do that because you still have time to do something wrong, so they don't want, your name on a building. But, it's been experiences on both sides of the family, and, it takes a lot of prayer. I'm sure black people's knees are raw from having to drop down and pray. You have to pray every day before you go out. You have to pray, the Holy Spirit cover your children. I worry now. I have 2 grandsons. My oldest grandson is going to be 16. I'm already so stressed about him, getting driver's license and wanting to drive. I hope we can delay that as long as possible, because it's a hard. It's hard, but I think we have to start these discussions. We have to start having open discussions, because everybody's like, well, racism doesn't exist, or, I'm not a racist. You really have to look in your own heart and, just be ready to and open to discussions and just you just have to, I feel like, come clean, and you do your part to make things better for everybody. It's incumbent on all of us, black, white, yellow, brown, doesn't matter what your color is. It's important for us to recognize that we have the issues and then go about making a change. We've got to stop talking about it. Ms. Moss even mentioned about, at church. It's funny, when I was in D.C., I never felt that I didn't know or feel like there was racism in the church. But being here in Kentucky, it feels like I'm always fighting. I'm always fighting within the church, just trying to, have where I should be able to come to church and just pray. I shouldn't have to come to church and fight the system, So I'm just hoping that, we start this open discussion and start looking at how we can make things better for all of our children, and just make this, it's cliche, but we need to make this world a better place. And it really starts with each and every one of us today. Today, we have to, make that change and, just open up our heart and be open. I know people will get, when you say, we need to deal with racism, and they'll say, well, I'm not a racist. We don't have racism. We do. We do. And I have my own prejudices. I do. And I'll admit it. I do. I have prejudices. And I pray and I work through those myself. So I think together we can make change and we can make positive change. And I just thank you for the opportunity to share, that story, like I said, because we've never really talked about it publicly. I think when I was with your group might have been the first time. So I just thank you all so much for inviting me here tonight.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much, Kim. I've given up on the timekeeping role. It just seems impossible to limit the time on any of these stories. Next up, Christopher, we welcome you. I'm going to put this on these, so yeah, I'll put it right there. It should pick up pretty
Okay,
well.
that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Mask off? Okay. All right, thanks. Guys, I'd first like to start out quickly just thanking the deacon and Tim and St. Patrick's for the invite. And then secondly, I would definitely want you all to just join in with me to just thank Ms. Moss and Kim for their testimonies, and very looking forward to Bennie's testimonies coming up. So when Tim had contacted our organization, Christopher 2X Game Changers, about this invite, and then when I read the email, when I sent it to Christy, she sent it back to me, and I looked at it, and it was about, tell a testimony about racism and all that. So I'll attempt to do that. Again, that subject matter carries carries a lot. It's very broad. And as far as being a black male, black person, you know, there's probably many stories that some could easily share with any audience about experiences of racism. I'll quickly go through some quick layers for 15 minutes or even shorter than that. But my grandmothers, one born in Lion Stations, Kentucky, the other one born in Shelbyville, Kentucky, in Shelby County in the 1800s, produced a mother and father, my father born in 1921, my mother born in 1924. And I vividly remember to this day, both of them have left us now. My father passed away in 1998, age 77. My mother passed away in November of 2018 at the age of 94 years old. But I vividly remember my father when we were talking at a very young age, when I asked him about racism, because I came up around the 60 time frame into the 70s, the 80s, 90s, of course now in the 2000s. And I asked him about his experiences with racism as a very young person. And he told me that you should never forget that the first experience as a black person you have with racism is when you are carried in your mother's womb. Because that experience in the mother's psyche and even physical experience transitions into the child for sure, even though you might not recognize it early on. The racism situation or the connection to racism through the psychological connection of that lineage, that biological lineage, has already started this process. So for me, I, as it relates to racism, had many encounters over the years as I was transitioning from child, teenager, into adult, and there's many stories behind that. Equally at the same time, my life was a turbulent life where I, unfortunately, self-inflicted wounds on myself at an early age in regards to being caught up in the criminal justice system, which gave me an experience about what racism entailed in there. Not only that, before that, gave me experience what it entailed in everyday life and going into the normal places like stores, coming across other individuals from different races, schools, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, those experiences, and I'm not the kind of person who cries sour grapes about woe is me, but for me, it was more or less like, okay, where is this anger coming from as it relates to another race when you encounter them? And the power of racism to me is very powerful and potent in the sense that people, I think, sometimes try to figure out, how do you cure racism? Well, to me, that's kind of akin to, how do you find a cure for cancer or heart disease? It's just not probable right now, even though we have great scientists working on these issues constantly, even as I speak. Racism is a powerful deal. It is within the beholder, and if one beholds that superiority in their mind, that I'm better than you because I'm more privileged than you because you're not the same color as me, you're not the same culture that I come from or acquainted with, well, guess what? That power starts to evolve in a way that's deadly for the next human being. So for me, I never really understood how I would escape the anger of racism until I wanted to grow up. But that was a painful growing up. And remember, I just talked about the criminal justice system that I was acquainted with self-inflicting wounds, never blaming anybody, from teenage years into adult years. 36 years ago, going on 36 years ago now, I went and I finished where I had my first federal sentence. 25, almost 26 years ago now, I had a state prison sentence. 23 years now, I've been out of prison. And I feel quite good about what has happened in the last 20 years publicly as it relates to my journey and me constantly being around young black males and females to talk about this journey of racism, and equally at the same time how racism, if we allow it to possess us in regards to hate, how the hate can make you ignorant and it can make you not understand your humanitarian causes that are embedded in you, that are ready to burst on the scene for great things only if you understand and use them in the right way. So with that said, for the last 20 years, publicly, what I did is I've disciplined, myself, I think, in a very neat way, to pride myself on how racism would never hold me down and how it would not affect in any kind of way my plight in regards to me being a human being that can evolve through troubling times to try to get back to society in a meaningful way and try to be a do-gooder on the earth instead of being a hellraiser on the earth. And I talk about this all the time to young individuals. And they ask me, how do you not stay angry with the stuff that you've encountered? How do you not stay angry when Breonna Taylor's mother called you the day after she got killed on March the 13th of 2020 and asked you to come in their life way before this thing went national? What advice was you giving them at the time, and how did you stay so calm? How do you have all these multiple relationships with LMPD, young individuals in neighborhoods who are in dire poverty, in pure hell because of reckless gun violence, and also very angry young blacks as it relates to race? How do you stay calm? And my answer is always repeatedly the same, that I pride myself not to let myself plug into the power source of racism, to possess my mind and my whole being in a way that I can't think for my grandchildren and my children, and for those who are around me that would lean on to me to say, how do we beat anger and ignorance? If I possess myself with this attitude that racism can just eat at my core and I can just hate, there's no benefit for me to try to sit up here and disseminate humanitarian vibes for us to at least coexist better. Not in necessarily a lovey-dovey way, but to coexist better on the principles of respect. And this is what I teach young blacks. Coexist with other communities on the principles of respect. And guess what? You will start to feel that building power from within where you feel like King Kong. And racism in itself will never conquer you. Even in the midst of the unrest in Metro Louisville in the summer of 2020 that I coined, young blacks, and some try to figure out how their relationships are different than some of ours from years past. Why were they so angry, and why did this evolution evolve in Metro Louisville in the way it did? I can tell you all quite frankly, the young blacks that I've been acquainted with for so many years, and equally those in the summer of 2020, their racism issues are no different than the ones in the past. I'm being honest about this. They have had a different experience in having coexisting relationship with whites in a different way than some of us grew up. And that's why at the end of the day, what I've tried to do in the way that I move as it relates to trying to deal with race amongst the young and whoever will listen, is I tell them, try to use your blackness in a universal way that can give justice and good deed thoughts to everyone on the planet Earth. You can stick to your position on black pride, but equally at the same time, you got to be willing to not do what somebody's been doing to you and even into your ancestors' lineage on the planet Earth. Why would you want to return evil for evil? That's just not intelligent to me. I believe wholeheartedly that the cry from young blacks in the summer of 2020 and the awakening, whether it was in the corporate world, whether it was in the business world locally or globally, as it related to the Black Lives Matters movement, was an awakening in itself for whites to look in the mirror again and say, what's going wrong? This time, what everybody had to witness is how young whites rose up and said they didn't like the ugliness of racism, which if you beholded the summer of 2020, not only in Metro Louisville, but across the country, that was an interesting observation in itself. Why did so many young whites rise up with blacks to say we will not tolerate these kind of attitudes? Was LMPD being picked on or not? I have a lot of friends that work in the Louisville Metro Police Department. Over time, I've took a lot of darts. When I say darts, unjust comments for good causes that I was about. Did I let that stop me from doing the right thing for any individual that requested my help in their life? Absolutely not. Because here's how we will not ever, in my opinion, beat racism. If we allow the power of others to dictate in our minds, here's what you should be and here's what you should not be, and you know your Supreme Court judge, your intuition is telling you different, and you know your good feeling inside of you is telling you different, you cannot follow the leader like that. And I tell this to young blacks all the time. I tell them you got a right to raise the issues you need to raise, but equally at the same time, how do we get to a better Louisville, a better Metro Louisville, and how do we coexist better, but to show that at the end of the day, we have a right to talk about serious issues as it relates to equality. And we have young whites standing with us, and even middle-aged whites, and some old whites standing with us like never before. But equally at the same time, don't overplay your card these days as it relates to racism. Understand that there are some whites and others who really want to understand what they don't understand about how we can coexist better as human beings on the planet Earth. And I believe at the end of the day, what we've got to do is we've got to not try too hard, but equally at the same time, we've got to release this pressure from within to say, I understand it all. I need to understand it all. Sometimes you can never understand it all. And you should not let that be a burden in the way that you interact with each other and the way that you try to remove, which is the quote-unquote white guilt from yourself about the way the black plight has been. What you need to understand is how can I be a better humanitarian towards everybody on the planet Earth, including black people who's went through horrific situations as it relates to the way they've been treated on the planet Earth. And at the same time, this is what Sister Kim and Ms. Moss were talking about earlier. At the end of the day, if we want to see each other better, we've got to do it with sincerity. Not necessarily understanding everything about everybody. But you know when you walk in the pathway of a person like Tim, it's about mutual respect. It's not about understanding everything about Tim. You all's audience should not bust your brain on trying to understand everything about a Christopher 2X. I've tried my best, and I would ask anyone over 20 years, anything's been documented, media-wise, video, print, radio, audio, anything, to find out when I was ever trying to disparage another person in regards to my work. I've never did that, but I've taken countless of hits because people never understood me, and they were really spinning their wheels too hard to try to find out who is this 2X figure here. Why does he have a name 2X? That in itself starts to put a person, sorry about that, in a position where you're already judging too quick and you don't want to take enough time to reach out to a person who's very accessible and be willing to sit down with anybody in Metro Louisville to talk about who Christopher 2X is. I understand what racism is. Even in my work of peace and justice efforts. And I might add before I wrap up, my work has been about trying to bring people together for better healing causes. So for a person to even comment in any other way or make a comment like he's a troublemaker or something like that, that's misinformation in their own mind. I've never caused that. If you look at my history in 20 years of Metro Louisville and trying to deal with issues, I did it in the most diplomatic way that I could do it in. But I kept my black pride, and I will keep my black pride. I've never asked a white person to ever think that you shouldn't feel that you count on the planet Earth too. I don't think like that. And there's not been a race in Metro Louisville, whether they come from the white community, the black community, African immigrant community, Hispanic community, Latino community, or otherwise, where if they ever approached me with a question or a request for help that was reasonable, that I wouldn't lend out my hand and help them. Because I've learned that racism has helped me springboard into a humanitarian mindset that I partake in and I embrace and I let it possess my being for the betterment of any human being that has that interaction with me. And most of the time, ladies and gentlemen, to be quite frank with you all, the people that never understood me because of their misjudging attitudes or their racist attitudes, when they got to meet me and they had any kind of interaction with me, they would leave away and do an about face and either feel shamed about the way they thought about me, and equally at the same time, they would say to themselves, I had him all wrong. Because we never took the time to really just take a deep breath and say, hold up, I'm judging people. And if you call yourself a person of a spiritual enlightenment or a spiritual connection to a cause for humanity in regards to religion, there's no way you should create these judgment attitudes in your mind. I know it takes time for us to evolve out of those attitudes, but equally at the same time, it benefits, like Sister Kim was saying and Miss Moss was saying, it benefits the children tremendously if you can let off those vibes to them. And I deal with children constantly every day, children who are in pure hellish conditions, and I let them know at the end of the day, you were birthed on this earth for purpose. And I'm proud to say, when they ask me, you went to prison at the state level and you went to prison at the federal level. And I equally tell them, I said, yes, I did. And they said, oh, well, recently we just heard that 2 Republican politicians gave you pardons. One Mapp Bevin on the state level, one Donald J. Trump before he left office in December of 2020 last year, gave me an unconditional federal pardon, clear across the board. All of that is gone, but I never asked for either one. This is true. I never asked Matt Bevin for a pardon. I never asked Donald J. Trump for a pardon. Governor Bevin and President Trump heard from some liaisons who who pitched and advocated in my behalf, and lo and behold, these pardons came up. But what I tell young blacks all the time is, the true applause and the true redemption and second chances starts from within, not because of any pardons. The pardons are some hardware that you can point to say, look at here, I got a second chance. But they're rare as you get. And I tell young blacks every day as I wrap up my comments, at the end of the day, when you put in hard work, your second chance starts. When you know that racism will never possess you in a way that will make you that angry, that you can't think straight for the benefit of your family and your community, then you know that you're well on your pathway to higher grounds as a humanitarian that can give justice to the whole planet Earth, and you can think of yourself in a way that my blackness is universal, because at the end of the day, I feel proud about being black, but at the same time, I love giving justice to everybody on the planet, even those who never gave justice to me. Thanks a lot, y'all.
Thank you, Christopher, so much. Thanks for being here. And Benny, you may want to chair. Do you want?
I'm gonna try it here.
Okay. I'll tell you what. I'll bring this down. If you want to take a seat, I think we can still see you pretty well. So if you do want to take a seat, you want to rest. Christopher, thank you. Okay. So, last but definitely not least, Mr. Bennie Ivory.
What about sitting right here? They can still see you.
Let me try
Oh,
it.
you want to try it right there? Okay, this is here for you if you need it.
Okay, appreciate it. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me here tonight. You know, I probably should have written down some comments, but I didn't, so I'm just going to kind of ramble on here tonight. I will say that I am a Catholic, a longtime Catholic, educated in Catholic schools for the first 9 years of my life. But my journey started on June 19th, 1951 in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The backdrop of my adolescence was Little Rock Central crisis. I think a lot of you who are probably familiar with that, but are you familiar with the lost year? Anybody know what that is? In 1957, Orville Faubus shut down or stood in front of Central High School, ordered the State National Guard to come in and to prevent the Little Rock Nine from integrating the Little Rock schools. He was unsuccessful. The next year, he shut down all the schools in Pulaski County, Arkansas, and all those students had to go someplace else to graduate if you were a senior. That's a story that, for some reason, hasn't been told. I think we would make a great movie. But that was the backdrop of my early years. So my lifelong ambition was to get the hell out of Arkansas. And I ended up spending 10 years in Mississippi. You know, I only say that jokingly because those 10 years were some of the best 10 years of my career, a 44-year career. From Arkansas, actually, I went to Louisiana first, spent 3 years there, and went to USA Today. Then I went to Jackson. And I have to say that growing up in Arkansas and having worked at the places where I've worked, I know racism is real. I've seen it, I've experienced it. I've seen it here, right here in Louisville, Kentucky. Every place that I have worked, I've gotten these love letters from readers. You can just imagine what they might have been. I came out of a two-parent household in Arkansas, and just me and my brother. I'm the oldest by 7 years, and they taught us to respect everybody. But they also taught us to respect ourselves. So they prepared us for what was out there. They prepared us for the racism. If you grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, any place in Arkansas, it was everywhere. I mean, you go downtown, I remember the separate drinking fountains. I remember the separate restrooms. I remember clerks not wanting to help you out, show you where things were. It was in education. Where we lived, there was a white elementary school probably 300 yards from where we lived. I couldn't go to school there. I had to go all the way across town to a black Catholic school. And that was a great experience. It really was. One thing about a Catholic education, you learn how to write. You do learn how to write. Which brings me to my first story about my experience with racism. My senior year in high school was integration. Went to Langston High School, which was a black school for 4 years after I left the Catholic school. And that was a very disappointing time for all of us. And, you know, things went pretty well, except, you know, the teachers that we had at Langston disappeared. The black coaches that we had disappeared, or they became assistant coaches. So, you know, our role models went away. They just disappeared magically. Late in the year, in an English class that I had, we had to do a term paper. So I did my term paper, turned it in. The teacher was white, and she called me aside and she said, "You didn't write this." I'm 17 years old. I said, "Yeah, I wrote it." "No, you didn't." "Well, what do you want me to say?" I wrote it, that's all I can tell you. Like I said, that good Catholic education taught me how to write. I could always write. So what I did, I never told my parents this story. I took that paper and I dumbed it down, resubmitted it, and I got a passing grade. Passing grade. Again, you know, my parents raised me and my brother to be strong, independent people. We dealt with it. I knew what I was dealing with, and I knew in my mind how to deal with it. That was the way to deal with it. Probably should have talked to my parents about it, but I didn't. Systemic racism. Anybody ever heard of the Kerner Commission report? It is the most definitive examination of race that's ever been done in this country. It was done in 1968 at the behest of Lyndon Johnson. It was a commission, I think 8 or 9 people were on it, including a lady, Catherine Pedden from Kentucky. She was a commissioner of commerce, I believe. It not only pointed out the problems, it provided solutions of what we needed to do. Needed to desegregate housing. Look at Louisville. It is one of the most segregated cities in America. Look at the West End. What's going on there? Education. Well, everybody knows that, you know, we were under a desegregation order here for years. Our schools are still struggling. We didn't address it soon enough. It also addressed the news media, because the news media had done a horrible job of reporting these issues and struggles with it today. Primarily because, not total, but largely because most newsrooms are not integrated. That might come as a surprise to you, but very few newsrooms are truly integrated. And very few newsrooms have top editors or mid-level editors. For a number of years, as I said, I was in the business for 44 years, and I went into editing after 10 years as a reporter. I decided I wanted to be a top editor, you know, and at one point in time in America, there were 8 black managing editors in America. Managing editor is the number 2 person in the job in the newsroom. It was so small, we all knew each other intimately. We'd call each other and compare notes, tell war stories and whatnot. Those are all true stories. 44 years in the industry. I worked for 8 different newspapers. I never took a job. I was the first person of color in every job that I took in every newsroom that I worked in. When I left, I was never replaced by a person of color. Never, ever. "44 years in the newspaper industry, I had one black publisher. Publisher is the guy he's the big boss. I worked for Curtis Riddle in Delaware. He and I worked together at USA Today, and we always said that we wanted to work together. So the timing seemed right. I was working in Florida at the time. He called me and said, "I want you to come to Delaware." And I did. That's where I met John, or that's where I hired John. Brought him over from Connecticut. You know, while in Delaware, we had a real unique situation there. Probably won't be replicated again. Curtis was he was an African-American publisher. I was the editor. My managing editor I hired was African-American. Our advertising director was African-American. Our associate editor of the editorial page was African-American. That won't happen again. Just won't. We used to get letters from our corporate headquarters from people, some of our readers, who wrote them, and Curtis shared one with me, and it was, "Do you all have any white people you can send to Delaware?" That's a true story. Absolute true story. One of the reasons why newsrooms should be integrated is because we have a view of the world. We know a lot of things that a lot of people don't have. But you also need different perspectives. And in 1985, I went to Jackson, Mississippi, as managing editor of the afternoon paper. After a couple of years, I took over both papers as managing editor. Anybody ever heard of Medgar Evers? Yes. Medgar was murdered in 1963. He was shot in the back in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi. Byron Della Beckwith was arrested not long after that, actually, for his murder. He was arrested in California. And he was tried twice, both times hung juries. Think about that. 1960s, early 1960 Mississippi, two all-white juries could not acquit him. Hung jury. He was that guilty. So he was released. In 1989, I reopened the case based on some information that we had gotten from, there was a secret spy agency, and this sounds contrived, but it's not. You can look it up. There was a secret spy agency in Mississippi called the State Sovereignty Commission. Its role solely was to preserve segregation. And it was a real insidious organization. As I said, it was very secretive. And they would do things like they would infiltrate the NAACP. Let's just say if you attended a meeting and the mole, so to speak, would go to your employer the next day and say, "Well, Joe was there." Well, Joe would get called in, and they would say, "Well, Joe, you know, we're having tough times, so we're going to have to lay you off." You never knew why, but that was the story. That happened over and over and over. So we got the files. They had been sealed by the state and were not supposed to be open for another 50 years or so. Somebody slipped them to me. And within those files, we found out that the Sovereignty Commission tampered with the jury, the second jury. So we wrote that story in 1989, and I have to tell you, there was not a lot of joy in our newsroom. Not everybody in our newsroom supported what we were trying to do. Some people said, well, he's an old man. It happened 30 years ago. But my position was that murder is murder. I don't care how long it happened ago. It's murder. The silence in Mississippi was deafening for weeks after that story ran. Then finally, the dam broke. The city council passed a resolution to reopen the case. The NAACP soon followed, and some other government entities followed suit. And the prosecutor was almost forced to reopen it. And, you know, there was a movie about this, and it paints the prosecutor as very different. The interest in that case was not nearly what was portrayed in that movie. It was a very reluctant prosecution. First of all, he said they couldn't find the file from the last court case. We wrote that story. Merle Evers, Medgar's widow, she had a copy of the file. So it took away that excuse. Then they said, well, we can't go forward because we can't find the gun. Well, Jerry Mitchell was the reporter who was working on this case. We had sent him to Tennessee to interview Byron Della Beckwith. And this is an absolute true story. I was walking through the newsroom, past his desk, the phone rang. Picked it up. The guy says, is Jerry Mitchell there? I said, no, but this is his editor. He said, I know where the gun is. He was a deputy who worked in the courthouse during that time. He said, the judge kept it as a souvenir. It was in the judge's house. It was at his house. So we did that story, took away that excuse. Make a long story short, he was indicted. He was brought back to Jackson. I never forget the day that they brought him in. And he, I think it was 2 years later, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and that's where he died. I tell that story because it matters to have diversity in your newsroom. It really does. And I also tell that story because what it amounts to is systemic racism. You know, 8 different newspapers I worked for, I was the first person of color who ever worked there. When I left, I was never replaced. Why is that? You have to ask yourself those questions. Why is that? It's systemic racism. And people who don't understand it, tell them that story. Maybe the light will come on. You know, there are other examples of racism that are perhaps more blatant. You know, calling somebody the N-word or whatever. But this thing, I got to tell you, I was in Mississippi for 5 years before I really understood what happened down there. And I have to tell you, it's worse than anything that I ever imagined. My next door neighbor, he was older than me. He went to college at Alcorn State University. It's about 70 miles southeast of Jackson. And he would hitchhike home on the weekends. And he told me that his mother said, son, when you see a car coming down the road, you get over in the bushes until it gets close enough to tell if it's a white person or a black person. It was that bad down there, that bad. The newspaper that I worked for was complicit with the White Citizens Council. They intentionally planted false stories about the NAACP, or anybody else who tried to push civil rights. We found that out in the same documents, Sovereignty Commission files that we found out about the jury tampering, and we did a story about that. This thing called racism, it's real, it's insidious. Is it better today than it was? Yes. But you know, you can stab somebody in the back with a 10-inch knife and pull it out 1 inch and say, is that better? Last few weeks, you know, I've heard our senior U.S. Senator talk about the exotic notion of African American history. The exotic notion that it was insignificant because it was exotic. Think about that. Slavery was the underpinning of this country from the very beginning. From the very beginning. We are not educating our children today about the history of this country. There are 16 states that are still teaching students that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Over states' rights. Well, yeah, states' rights to have slavery, free labor. That's what that was about. You know, we have an issue here that needs to be addressed, and for too long we have been ignoring it, looking the other way. I've been here for 24 years, and I could see it coming. One thing about having worked at different places, you have a point of reference. You know, you've seen what's happened in other locations, and I saw the same thing happening here that I saw in Jackson, Mississippi back in the 80s. When I got to Jackson, 1985, homicides are in the mid-teens. When I left, almost 10 years later, it was over 100. Sound familiar? Nobody did anything about it because it was happening primarily on the West End. Police department. John can tell you, we wrote reams and reams about problems within the police department. You know, the mayor, you know, everybody wants to point fingers at Greg Fisher, and sure, he deserves some of it. This was going on long before he got there. Long before he got there. So when we look at this issue, we have to go back in time and look at all of the history to get to where we need to be. You know, it's unfortunate that it looks like it's going to take the federal government to come in here and set the record straight on what is going on here in our city. And this is a great city. I like it. Some things about it I don't like, but it's a great place to be. You know, I got in this business because I found out early that when we do it right, we make a difference. And you know, when I left the business back in 2013, it was with a heavy heart. And you know, it's painful to see what's happened to our local media here. But I will say this, you all as readers, you can hold them accountable and call down there and say, we need better. You need to do better. You need to do better. You're their customers. Leadership in this state, and I'll just talk about this state and this city because this is where I live, and leave the national politics up to other people. but we need leadership here. Each of us has the responsibility and obligation to put people in office who are going to do the right thing. We don't have that here. We don't have it in the city. We don't have it on the state level. We don't have it on the federal level. What we have is a senior U.S. senator saying that black history is insignificant and exotic. We have a junior U.S. senator who goes around acting like a little boy saying stupid stuff all the time. All the time. Look at the statistics. We are, oh, thank God for Mississippi. Education, economy, health outcomes, we're almost at the bottom. Mitch has been there for 40 years. I'll leave it at that.
For the entire panel, let's show our gratitude one more time, if we could, please. Thank you. I think we're at about 8:45. Am I correct? So our original plan was to have an hour for questions and so forth, but I want to deliver on my promise to the panel to give you a chance to comment on the other panelists. And Kim, I will just come to you.
Well, not necessarily on the other panelists. There was one important thing I forgot. It was about the power of one. Back when I was telling you about my father-in-law integrating the schools, well, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law were escorted into the school by the National Guards. There was a group of Ku Klux Klan folks that came to the school to get my sister-in-law. The plan was to lynch her. She had a teacher, a white teacher. One, the power of one. She heard that they were coming, and she hid my sister-in-law under her desk. Those men came in carrying rifles. She kept her cool, and my sister-in-law hid under that desk. My sister-in-law is now a PhD in education. She has 5 children. All 5 of her children are valedictorians. All 5 are engineers. Her daughter is, I can't remember what, anyway. This girl had close to about $1 million in scholarship. She went to Stanford, earned her master's and her PhD. She's now an assistant dean there at the medical school. She was the first black female to get this particular engineering degree from Stanford University. Can you imagine if that one person had not put herself on the line and put herself forward to save my sister-in-law? Look at what difference that made to this country, to this state, just having that one person. So a lot of us would say, I can't make a difference. What can I do? Yes, one can make a difference, and it starts with you.
Thank you, Kim. Others on our panel, do you have any comment? Yes.
I'll just be real quick. I would ask everybody out here, one thing I'm asking a lot of young blacks, male and females, to go and revisit, because it was before their time, but even some of the Hollywood-produced pieces as it relates to stories of inequality and racism still have, like Bennie was describing a few minutes ago as it relates to the murder of Medgar Eggers and Byron Della Beckwith, a murder's a murder. And regardless of how long it is, it's still what it is. So what I want to suggest to those who are listening and viewing, I would ask you all to consider going back and looking at some level, even on the internet, which is very accessible, the Roots miniseries, some part of it. Equally at the same time, the autobiography of Jane Pittman, which is very powerful also. and equally Mississippi Burning that came out in the mid-'80s. I think is some just good content to get a grasp on how that what I'm using with the kids I'm dealing with is to let them know when they look at that, they'll get angry, but at the same time, how do they process out of that anger into a healthy mindset for change and positive change, even out of witnessing and hearing about ugliness. So I would ask the whites that are viewing in on this to go back and share that with your children and educate from it.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you. Anyone else on the panel have any follow-up comments? Yes, Bennie.
You know, I would just encourage everybody to go back and read the Kerner Commission report. It's available online, and I think that it will be eye-opening. You know, if we're looking for solutions to what's going on, not to say that it doesn't need some updating, but there's a lot to work with there because it addresses everything that we're dealing with today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Loueva.
They all get this booklet. Did they have that?
They don't all, no.
You know, oh, I was just asking Tim. I'm sure if you call Ms. Turner at the office of Multicultural, you must have this booklet, Walking in My Shoes. The main reason, again, as part of what this process is about, because this isn't a one and done. This is just a beginning and an initiation, I'll say, into about racial injustice. But in it, there's about 3 pages of all kinds of resources. And I know most of you probably have teenagers or grandchildren who have all that technology skill of YouTube and everything else. And most of these are YouTube. It would be interesting, like on a nice Sunday evening or one day, to get your family together. You don't have to look at the whole thing, but just pick one and kind of begin to look at it and have a short discussion with your family of how that impacts you today with what we see within just our community, not nationally. Just concentrate on Jefferson County and how it impacts them. Because, see, don't depend on your school system to educate your children, not on African American or Black history or what happened. Okay, they just need to know, and it's not about decision-making or anything like that. It's about learning, being educated, and knowing, as Sister Thea Bowman used to say, the true truth. Just know the true truth. And then how you process it and what you do with it, it's on you. But you can't say you didn't know. Okay, thank you, Tim.
Sure. Thank you, Loueva. Loueva is holding up Sure. I'm just going to display it. It's this resource. It's called Walking in My Shoes, the challenge to eradicate racism. It presents a framework that we are using in this series, okay? So tonight was about listening to learn, right? Listening to stories. Then the next one will be, a documentary that we need to figure out how we're going to do that. We might show it here. We think we will. We think we have a small enough group. We might go into another space for better projection and whatnot. But anyway, so it gives us a framework here at St. Patrick to explore racism and to literally walk in the shoes of those of color who've been discriminated against over an extended period of time, over centuries. So anyway, it's a fabulous resource, and it has lots of links and other resources within it that help us to study this issue and to really immerse ourselves in it. I'm aware of time. We've probably got, 5 minutes? 7 minutes. Okay, great. So we have a little bit of time for any questions or comments for any of our panelists. Just raise your hand. I will come to you with the mic. Ann, I'm on my way. Okay.
So thank you all so very much. This was very helpful. Perhaps all of us here are on a part of our personal journey, and so thank you for sharing your stories. Kim, you said something in particular with your faith about your experiences, forgiveness. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You know, I think we serve a God that's a forgiving God.
Hold it out. There you
Our God is a forgiving God. And I was raised, you know, my mom, you know, it's like somebody slap you, turn your cheek. You know, it's not an eye for an eye, you know, kind of thing. And not praying takes you into a different place. And being, you almost have to have faith to survive. Because sometimes the hatred that you can encounter, like Christopher 2X says, if you allow it, it can consume you and just eat you from the inside out. And what you have to realize is, you know, when you encounter that type of hatred, it's not everybody. It's not everybody. It's, you know, it's that one individual, and all you can do, my mother would always say, pray for them, is what my mom would say. You know, if you encountered someone that, you know, she would just say, pray for them. That's how I was raised. So your enemy, you pray for your enemy. You pray. And that's what my mom would, you know, say to me. And that's how, you know, that's what I would do. And it really helps you to survive and to grow as a person. And because my ultimate goal is, you know, to make it to heaven. And I can't make it there with hatred in my heart. So, you know, my faith teaches me to pray and get down on my knees, and that's what I do. So, I don't know what else to say, but.
Pull that out again and click you.
Go ahead. Yes, you're good.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Kim. Anyone else with a comment, a question for the whole panel, one panelist? Bennie, we really got a unique perspective from your sharing and your storytelling that I just didn't expect, and it was fabulous. Of course, I'm a former journalist myself, you know, kind of a little pitiful weekly group that I was a part of, and then two years in a daily. But still, some of those stories that you broke, that with great effort, I'm quite sure, and with some peril, personal peril involved. That's heroic journalism. That's powerful, and what truth came out as a result. You took some risks for the truth, but we would not have heard that story without you being here tonight. So thank you. Anyone else with a question? Yes, coming your way. Thank you, man.
I believe our fifth meeting is one where we talk about what actions we could take either individually or as a group. And I was wondering, may not be enough time tonight, but if you can share with us some actions. I know I've heard tonight praying and reading, but I'm actually talking about some actions beyond that. If you have any suggestions to us as a group or as a Catholic community of St. Patrick, I think all of us would be interested in learning what your thoughts might be in that area.
Yeah, we thank you for that question. Anyone panelist want to? You know, we do have a whole session with two presenters on that for that fifth event, and we're bound to hear some good things from. Yeah, I think the action of being here and learning is a big one. Opening yourself up, opening your heart, your mind to another person's experience, walking in their shoes, literally as they tell their story. Yes. Christopher's got a point, sorry.
I'm going to be a little bit redundant again, and I would ask you all as a collective to consider, and I'll give you my choice. Roots is a long mini-series, but if you could just either consider pulling up as a collective and just allowing the young, the old, whoever, to just sit back for about an hour and a half, hour and 30 minutes, or in increments and look at it and stop. Go get the video or bring up the video, the autobiography, of Jane Pittman. I think it's just well placed. She died in over 100 years old. It's a story that kind of evolves out of Louisiana and when she was in deep slavery and all that, but equally at the same time, Cicely Tyson masters that TV series piece. And it's such a powerful piece where you can just, when you're finished with it, or even, like I said, you look at certain parts of it, cut it off, you can have discussions for growth, and especially for young people who have never entered into that space because they never understood that time. So I'm talking about a Hollywood production, but it just gets as real as it gets because of the spirit, lastly, of that time frame which it was created around roots and Mississippi burning and all that. It gives especially the young an understanding on here's ugliness, how do we correct ugliness for the betterment. And again, lastly, don't try too hard to please everybody. Not a black person, not a person of other cultural backgrounds or colors. Just try to do your best to be the best humanitarian you can be.
Very good, thank you. And Kim?
Just one thing on that point is lift your voice up. When you see injustices, write letters, call the media. When, say, for example, when the Breonna Taylor case came up, we did not hear from our Catholic communities. The first to come out was Unity Church was the first to come out when I saw them on the news to speak out against what happened against racism. And then some other churches came out. We were Johnny-come-latelys. We came out a little later. We had the black churches in West Louisville got together and we did a march to the courthouse. Then a couple weeks later, the Archbishop came out and said a little something, and we walked from the cathedral again to the courthouse. But as a collective, as an entire faith community, we did not come out and speak up against what was happening at the time, and we still really haven't done that. So I think that's we see it all the time, but we need to speak up against it. We've been talking for years about the fact that West Louisville does not have one single Catholic school, not one. And it's not that the black Catholics don't want to go Catholic school. We can't afford it. But this is a rich church as a whole, that they can afford to build at least one church in West Louisville. School. And when you look at your school, how many teachers of color do you have within your school here? What are you teaching? When you teach history, how are you teaching the true history of this country? How are you teaching black history? And you can't say, well, our kids are white, they don't need to learn black history. We all need to know everybody's history. Without knowing your history, you can't go forward unless you know where you've come from. History, black history is everybody's history. American history is everybody's history. So, look and see what you're doing right here. What change can you make just within your faith community of St. Patrick's, to make a difference, in the community. So that's where it starts. When you see something, you hear an injustice, you see, write a letter, make some phone calls. That's where it starts, because they think nobody cares.
Very good, Kim. Thank you. Yes, Benny. You have your own mic.
Yeah, sure. Well, I just want to piggyback on what she just said. You know, the Catholic Church was deeply involved in the 60s in the civil rights movement. And, you know, not just the Catholic Church, but other churches have kind of backed away from that. And as I said, we have a leadership void in this community. It doesn't matter who steps up, and there's no reason why the Catholic Church and other churches can't help fill that void. The other point I wanted to make was there's a documentary called 13, the 13th. It's about the 13th Amendment. I would strongly encourage everybody to look at it. Go on YouTube. You can get it. It's free. It is eye-opening. It's eye-opening. And just one other thing on Black history. I've been working on a project with the Clark Foundation for the past year to try to get Black history introduced into the public school systems of Kentucky. We have 172 school districts in this state, and very, very few are teaching Black history. You know, I don't want to put it in a silo because it is American history. It ought to be taught as part of American history, which is required. But African American history is not required to be inculcated in the curriculum. But we have been working on this for about a year. We're trying to establish a center that will pull together curriculum. Right now we're working with Berea College, the Muhammad Ali Center in Kentucky State. It's still, you know, kind of elusive, but we have put in a lot of work. Something's going to come out of I can assure you that. And it's something that's just really badly needed. And not only this state, and if we do this right, we think that we can put together a program that will be turnkey, that can be spread across the country, because it's not being taught well anywhere. So.
Very good, Benny. We are at the end of our time, maybe even a little bit over. Benny mentioned the 13th. That's our movie of choice next Thursday. So he said what he said is correct. It is available online, and it's free. It is impactful for sure. So we expect to come back next week. We may watch portions of it, but open up for more discussion than viewing, if that sounds agreeable to everyone. So I want to thank you who assembled for this to listen and to learn. You opened yourselves up in a way that maybe you haven't in your life, and this is easily one of the coolest things I've ever been a part of in 33 years of Catholic ministry. So being in your company, panel, was a real eye-opening experience, a learning experience, but I'm really grateful to have had it. So thank you for obliging us here and to coming and sharing your story. Thank you very much, all. We are concluded.